and royalty from around the Western world all getting together, and the problem I have with it all is the secrecy. They say it's all privacy and it helps for the whole thing to be confidential because people can then be honest and share their views. But that's fine as regards the business people. What it's not fine is when with regard to our elected politicians, people like Kenneth Clarke, the Justice Secretary. What is he doing going along to these Bilderberg conferences and then swearing to secrecy? What happens is he will not mention the Bilderberg. If there's a policy which comes out through, which is a consensus, an artificial consensus which is agreed at Bilderberg, he'll chat about that, but he would never mention that it was discussed at the Bilderberg conference, which is what's called the Chatham House rule. Now I think, this kind of thing speaks for itself. Chatham House in London is a private policy think tank that is now more powerful than the British Foreign Office. It's a private club that sets British foreign policy. So by using the Chatham House rule, what you're saying is that basically this is all private, mate. Even though we're talking about public policy, none of the public are allowed to know, nor the press. So that's the big problem I have with the Bilderberg conferences, is the secrecy. Also, I've been to several of these conferences and they just spin you a whole load of lies about what's actually happening and who's in attendance. I mean, you get an official list as everybody leaves. Now, it's called a press release. What kind of press release is released after an event is finished? That's not a press release. It's just a sop to the press. And also, it's a kind of subtle warning to the press to say, look, these people are extremely powerful who are in here, and they have insisted on secrecy, so don't mess with them. And often, of course, you'll see names of senior press people on that list. For example, Rupert Murdoch, News International's general manager, chief executive, is regularly on the list. Marcus Agius, who's a trustee now of the BBC, former Barclays Bank guy, he's on the list. So whilst we've got media people actually complicit in this whole Chatham House rule, we're not going to talk about what's going on here with politicians. We're talking about finance ministers from some of the... I mean, for example, the Greek finance minister. Greece is going through tremendous problems right now. And strikes, even intervention of the army to stop strikes. So when you've got the Greek finance minister, who I actually met at one of these Bilderberg conferences, he'd come out to buy some cigarettes just to get out because he said the atmosphere was really stifling him. And the cigarettes were really expensive inside the hotel. But you can see that there's an immense amount of pressure being put on the politicians who are there. And they feel like they have to go in order to be kind of part of the club. But I think that what they're doing is they're basically selling out the people who've elected them by attending these meetings. And I'd like to see all politicians right across the NATO zone boycott these conferences. The idea is we're supposed to trust them. If you look at what's going on in the economy right now, it's quite clear we can't trust them. The money that should be being spent into our economy to keep our country going, keep small businesses going, being lent into the economy, maybe even through public works, putting people to work, is simply not happening. There is no money, according to the bankers. We all know, anyone that looks into this can see that these bankers can make up out of nowhere as much money as they want, and they could get the economy going tomorrow if they felt like it, but they're actually using their economic might as a political hammer to hammer their way through into the political process, and they're basically holding a gun against the head of the politicians, as you've seen with these IMF bailouts as they go around Europe and even in the United States, holding a gun against the head of the politicians and saying, well, if you want your public employees to be paid next week, then you better do as we say, hadn't you? Now, back in the 1970s, a very similar thing happened with Harold Wilson, who was a British Prime Minister, Labour Prime Minister at the time. And he called the bluff of the bankers in the City of London, and he said, look, if you're going to play at this game, then let's have a general election and base it on who's in charge, whether it's us or whether it's me. And they backed off. But I can tell you what, they got rid of him a few years later through the Wilson plot and dirty tricks with various senior politicians' houses being bugged and burgled. And Harold Wilson was gotten rid of, even though he'd been very good Prime Minister and very seriously loyal to his people. He was bumped out by MI5, who came out with all these stories about him working for the Russians, something ridiculous. So you can see there's a power play going on between the politicians, who sometimes are in league with the bankers, other times they actually want to do what's best for the country. There are some decent politicians out there, whatever people may say. And And what the Bilderberg Conference does is it tips that balance away from the people and into the hands of the big bankers, the international financial elite. And that's the big problem with it, basically. And every politician that goes along to one of these meetings is basically selling their soul to the devil. They're selling it to the international financial elite, who have no interest in ordinary people. They just want more control, more power and more profits, because these people have got so much money they don't know what to do with it. They've got yachts, you know, they pay themselves these massive bonuses, they've got as many prostitutes as they could ever wish for. What do they want more? They want political power. They want control of the press and the media, this kind of thing. And they're getting it. You know, you look at what the deal that's just been done with Rupert Murdoch to extend his power on the British press. So they're getting their way with the politicians because they can, you know, the politicians are in bed with the media people because they need positive press coverage to win elections, and they're also in bed with the financial people because they need the money to keep their economies going. And actually they are selling themselves out at these Bilderberg conferences.
They must be breaking the law as well.
Certainly the US politicians, I think they are breaking the law, but in Europe it's not necessarily so clear. I just want to make it clear, it's the NATO countries that go to the Bilderberg conferences. Some people seem to think that it's, you know, all different countries are able to go, but it's not. It's very much, in fact, if you have a look on the Voltaire Network website, Thierry Meyssan has just put together, I'm talking about May 2011, put together a very good article showing the connections between the Bilderberg conferences and NATO. The origins of the conferences really were, it was the Central Intelligence Agency, what was at the time the OSS in America, alongside the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I talked about these private clubs earlier. The CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, is a private club that runs American foreign policy. It advises the State Department, but actually it's got far more resources than the State Department has, and it's one of the reasons why America has been so aggressive since World War II, is because a lot of private American companies want the American military to go and do their dirty work for them in places like Cuba, etc., to take over countries so that they can then use those countries to grow food and this kind of thing, to have their way in those other countries. So they're really pernicious, these private clubs. The Council on Foreign Relations War and Peace Studies Groups was meeting in 1942, 1943, during the Second World War, believing that the Nazis were going to be defeated. But their whole idea, way back in the middle of World War II, was to make sure that they won the peace. That is to say, US companies gained a massive foothold in Europe. And so this was to bind, you know, this is one of the things that Charles de Gaulle, the French leader after World War II, was really afraid of. He was saying that the Americans had got far too much power in Europe, and they were using NATO. That's one of the reasons the French stayed out of NATO for many years, and are now, you know, not necessarily totally content with being a player in NATO. Certainly the French people are not behind the intervention in Libya. So the NATO zone is Bilderberg. It's a kind of political club where political leaders are wined and dined and wooed by these heads of state, by kings and queens, all saying, well, come on, you know, you need to get on this IMF program. They know what they're doing. Well, that may work for these on these political leaders as a kind of hypnosis, but for the vast majority of us, we don't trust these bankers and these chief financiers. And so that's the kind of charade that's going to be being played out in St. Moritz. The Bilderbergers are going to be trying to woo our elected politicians on both sides of the Atlantic in the NATO countries onto their programme. And that programme, it seems pretty clear to me, is to topple the leaders in the Arab world that they don't like, and including places like Pakistan, which is obviously a nuclear-armed country, a Muslim country, which is at the moment having all sorts of fallouts with the Central Intelligence Agency, because the CIA has been proven through this guy Raymond Davis, working for Blackwater, to have been actually peddling weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, potentially biological weapons as well, to the Taliban. He was arrested by the Pakistanis, and then the Pakistanis said to the Americans, what are you doing, allowing these kind of crazy Blackwater XE Rambo characters to be supplying the Taliban with weapons? And Al-Qaeda, what is going on? And of course the reason for this is that they're trying to set them up, basically, that people like Raymond Davis are in there to give the ammunition to the Taliban, to the enemy, so that they can then